Good evening. I see so many familiar faces. I think you can do my routine for me up here. You've heard me do this so many times. My name is Marty Allen, and I'm chairman of the Gerald R. Ford Foundation. And I have the easiest part of the evening, but part of it's a little commercial. But there are some people here tonight that I would be remiss if I didn't introduce. You know, this is, and I think some of you have been at every one of the speakers during the February. This is the fourth. And during the month of February, we're celebrating President's Month, and George Nash is going to be our speaker to close it out. But it's been a marvelous series, and we're just very glad to bring it to you. My commercial's quick. I think it's the best deal in town because it's free. Even the entrance fee here to come in and see an exhibit is way below whatever is being paid by a lot of people to go to other places, and the children are free. And that's really at the wish of President Ford when we started out here, was that this was going to be a building to really do what we could to contribute to the living history. And I'm just pleased with what's happened this month and before that, but I would appreciate your consideration again, if you're not members, and I'm beginning to say this and don't really look out here and see people who aren't members of the Friends of Ford, but if you aren't and you want to see us to continue to do this and continue to see the exhibits, it would help a lot to make a very small investment and become a friend of Ford and join us. There's some brochures as you leave when you go out. That's the commercial. I just want to take a minute here to introduce a few people. Starting with Grand Valley, there's a good reason, and that banner should have been up here a long time ago, because it's so symbolic of the partnership that's been created between the school and the Gerald R. Ford Foundation Museum and Library. And there are some people here from Grand Valley that are so significant in that role. Let me start out with Mr. and Mrs. Jim Brooks. And Donna Brooks is one of the trustees of Grand Valley State University. Her husband Jim, and I say it in that order because she outranks him by being a trustee, but he's also the president of the Grand Valley State Foundation. And I don't know where you are because I don't see you. Where are you? There they are, right there, Jim and Donna Brooks. And it's people like that who volunteer their time and make the stewardship kind of commitment that they do that makes Grand Valley great and helps us in these programs like this. There is one person here who, I don't know, we gave her a little bit of an accolade at dinner, but I got to do it again because it's just a must. Whenever you have these kind of affiliations like this, you have great relationships with the president of the university and various people that are so important in making happen. But as you all know, there's sort of people kind of behind the scenes, and the person that really has made this happen is Pat Old. Pat is a vice president of Grand Valley State University. I had the pleasure of working with Pat when we went through the process of selecting the director of the Hohenstein Center, and how fortunate we were to end up with Gleaves Whitney. And just to give a little equal time to the Gerald R. Ford Foundation, there are two trustees here, and one is really my right-hand person, and that's John Babb. John is the treasurer of the Gerald R. Ford Foundation, and I can't tell you the number of hours he has put in to make the foundation, and John, we appreciate that. And then, you know, Fred Meyer, what can I say about Fred? Fred is a charter member of the Board of Trustees of Ford Foundation. He's now an honorary trustee. He's got his boss with him, Lena, tonight. But Fred and Lena are a treasure to this community, and the Ford Foundation has had the benefit of their stewardship, and I can never say enough about the two of you, and this community cannot say enough about the two of you. Fred and Lena Meyer, thanks for being here. As always, we're very appreciative of our own staff that's here. I won't go through those names tonight, but they do a marvelous job, just as Gleaves staff over at the Hohenstein Center does to make this happen. Well, I said that Pat and I take a lot of credit for Gleaves Whitney, and so my next job is to bring Gleaves forward. Gleaves has been so much, in so many ways, responsible for this February series. We've had some marvelous meetings about the future relationship and what we're going to bring to you. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Gleaves Whitney. Gleaves.
Well, thank you, Marty, as always, for that very generous introduction. And I want to second all of the acknowledgments that you made, the Brooks and Pat Olt and everybody else, the Myers on this side of the street, everybody who comes together to make these programs happen. It's marvelous what we are able to offer here. And I think the Hallenstein Center for Presidential Studies and Grand Valley State University are very proud to be able to be in a partnership here and to help underwrite events such as tonight's event. I really think we have something unique going in this community, and I know I'm very proud to be a continuing part of it. We know Herbert Hoover, who is the focus of this evening's talk, was one of the most unfortunate of presidents. On the eve of his election, he just didn't know the hand that history would deal him. You know, Lincoln had the advantage, if you can call it that, of knowing that there would very likely, very good possibility, there would be a civil war that would break out at some point in his tenure as president. And his speeches reflect that apprehension. Franklin Delano Roosevelt also had the advantage, again, if you can call it that, of knowing that there would be a very high probability that the United States would be drawn into world war, and his speeches from 1940 on certainly reflect that. Herbert Hoover, by contrast, was running for president in 1928 when it seemed that there would be just endless prosperity, limitless wealth gained in the United States and around the world. In fact, in his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention in 1928, he said, quote, "The poorhouse is vanishing among us. We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of our land." Close quote. Well, of course, the stock market crashed within a year, and you know the rest of the story. It's one of those ironies of history. He just didn't know, couldn't know. Well, with us this evening to help us better understand Herbert Hoover and the ironies of his time is a distinguished presidential historian, George Nash. Dr. Nash earned his PhD in history at Harvard University, where he was a research fellow at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History. In 1975, Dr. Nash was commissioned by the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Association to write the definitive multi-volume biography of Hoover. And to wide critical acclaim, Dr. Nash had a 3-volume biography about our 31st president that is titled The Life of Herbert Hoover. That work led Dr. Nash to his current endeavor, a much-anticipated book on the political and personal tensions that developed between Hoover and FDR. We'll be anxiously awaiting that volume. Dr. Nash has also written a book which is now in its 2nd edition, The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America since 1945, and it is the definitive study of the American right. Which brings me to one of my favorite stories about Dr. Nash. Back in 1974, soon after he had finished his dissertation at Harvard, George paid a visit to William F. Buckley, Jr. in Connecticut. And about that visit, Buckley later said, I quote, "George Nash couldn't have been as old as he said he was. To me, he looked like a matriculating freshman at the University of Oslo." Close quote. Well, the man who looked like a freshman back in 1974 has, 3 decades later, matured into a seasoned scholar. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. George Nash.
Well, thank you very much, Gleaves, and good evening, everyone. My thanks to you for that very gracious and generous introduction. My thanks to Marty Allen for his good words a few moments ago. And I send my greetings to some old friends in the audience and to the new friends I've had the pleasure of making this evening at the earlier receptions. I've come just a few minutes ago from a dinner that some of us had in one of the Grand Valley buildings on campus nearby. And it reminds me of a reform that Herbert Hoover once proposed for American life. And that was that all after-dinner speeches should be given before dinner. On the grounds, he said, that that would tend to speed up the terminals. Well, that reform was never implemented, and here we are tonight, and I have no incentive for brevity. On reflection, though, Gleaves hasn't reimbursed my travel expenses, so perhaps that's incentive enough. But it is certainly an honor as well as a pleasure to be at this platform under the auspices of the Hauenstein Center and of the Gerald Ford Museum and the Gerald Ford Foundation. I have spent much of my professional career in and around presidential libraries, notably the Hoover Library in Iowa, and this is the first time that I have been inside the Ford complex here, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of it before I have to leave this vicinity. But it is really good to be here. Many of you in this audience are no doubt familiar with a statement attributed to Abraham Lincoln, that you can fool some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. Some of you may also be familiar with a version of this remark attributed to H.L. Mencken. You can fool some of the people all of the time, said Mencken, and all of the people some of the time, and that's enough. In 2004, it is easy to be cynical like Mencken about politics. But no cloud of expediency surrounds the man whose career I shall examine this evening. In the 3/4 of a century almost since he left the presidency, few observers have accused Herbert Hoover of fooling the people. Yet around Hoover, almost 40 years after his death and 130 after his birth, clouds of a different sort remain to be dispelled. Where in the spectrum of American statesmanship does he belong? A hero in the 1940s and 1950s of libertarian politicians like Senator Robert Taft, he is today castigated by libertarians as the true father of the New Deal interventionist state. A vehement anti-communist, a friend of Joseph McCarthy and Richard Nixon, Hoover was nonetheless hailed in the 1970s by some left-wing historians as a profound critic of global interventionist anti-communism. A proud patron of conservative causes after World War II, an ally of William F. Buckley Jr. in the founding of National Review in 1955, a supporter of Barry Goldwater in 1964, Hoover in recent years has been stigmatized in conservative circles as a cheerless apostle of balanced budgets and high taxes. Acclaimed in his day as the greatest Republican of his generation, he was likened in the 1980s, even on the right, to Jimmy Carter. Surely it is noteworthy that Ronald Reagan's first act, one of his first acts as president, was to hang a portrait of Calvin Coolidge in a prominent place in the White House, and that he was known to quote Franklin Roosevelt, but not Hoover, in his speeches. It is noteworthy, too, that a few years ago in the Wall Street Journal, a leading conservative politician, Jack Kemp, contrasted Reaganomics with what he derisively called Hooverism. To Kemp and other exponents of supply-side economics, Hoover most decidedly is no role model. And in fact, there was a little echo of that in the lead editorial this morning in the Wall Street Journal. If contemporary conservatives no longer claim Hoover as one of their own, contemporary liberals have scarcely rushed to embrace him. To be sure, it is now possible to find among liberal historians expressions of respect for Hoover and of sympathy for his struggle as president, sentiments liberals during his lifetime seldom uttered. In fact, in the past decade or so, Hoover has probably received more sympathetic coverage in left-of-center media than in right-of-center ones. In Congress, his most persistent defender during the past generation was the liberal Republican senator from Oregon, Mark Hatfield. Nevertheless, in 1996, when Arthur Schlesinger Jr. asked a very liberal group of historians to rank the American presidents, their composite judgment was that Hoover was an outright failure. When Time magazine in 1998 asked 9 historians, again nearly all of them liberal, to judge the 17 presidents of the 20th century, Herbert Hoover finished dead last. So it is that we confront a curious datum. More than 7 decades after he entered the White House, Herbert Hoover remains a political outcast, unwelcome in liberal and conservative pantheons alike. Underlying this bipartisan aversion has been a continuing ambiguity in Hoover historiography. Who was Herbert Hoover? Somehow, despite all the research and the analysis, he remains an elusive figure. Was he, historians have wondered, an ossified 19th century liberal, or a sophisticated 20th century corporate liberal? A spokesman for rugged individualism, or a proto-New Dealer? The last of the old presidents, or the first of the new? Many factors account for the historical haze that continues to envelop this man. First, there is the sheer breadth and duration of his career. Born in 1874 in a little Iowa farming community, Hoover was orphaned before he was 10. By the time he was 21, he had worked his way through Stanford University and had entered his chosen profession of mining engineering. At the age of only 24, he was superintendent of a gold mine in the outback of Western Australia. By the age of 27, he had managed a coal mining enterprise with 9,000 employees in northern China and had survived a harrowing brush with death in the Boxer Rebellion. By 1914, at the age of 40, Hoover was an extraordinarily successful mining engineer who had traveled around the world 5 times and had business interests on every continent except Antarctica. And I'll just say parenthetically, at one point in my research, I found a little sheet of paper in which Hoover tabulated the number of weeks in his life that he had spent on ships at sea, mostly during those early mining years. It was something like 100 weeks, almost 2 years of his life spent on ships at sea. With the outbreak of World War I, Hoover rose to international prominence as founder and director of the Commission for Relief in Belgium, a humanitarian relief agency that ultimately brought food to more than 9 million French and Belgian civilians every day, an unprecedented undertaking in world history. After serving as head of President Woodrow Wilson's wartime food administration, he returned to Europe after the armistice for 10 months as a peacemaker and Director General of the American Relief Administration, organizing the supply of food for starving millions, facilitating the emergence of stable economies, and helping thereby to check the advance of Bolshevik revolution in Central Europe. Thanks in considerable measure to the Herculean efforts of Hoover and his staff, perhaps 1/3 of the population of Europe was saved from privation and death. By the time Hoover's European relief work wound down in 1923, more than 80 million people had received food allotments for which he was at least partially responsible. Of Hoover, it has been said that he was responsible for saving more lives than any other person in history. In the 1920s, when he served as Secretary of Commerce under Presidents Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge, it was said of Hoover that he was undersecretary of every other department as well, sometimes to the annoyance of those other department secretaries. So energetic and resourceful was he. Indeed, one distinguished historian has jocularly remarked, while Hoover had only one term in the presidency, he had almost as many years in the White House as Franklin Roosevelt. Certainly, it seems correct to say that between 1921 and 1933, Hoover was the most influential man in American public life. The first person to have his image transmitted over television in 1927, the first president to have a telephone permanently on his desk. Hoover seemed to many contemporaries to be, to borrow a current phrase, on the cutting edge of societal evolution. After his 4 years in the White House, he went on to live longer as a former president, over 31 years, than any other former chief executive in our history. These were strenuous years, too. Even in his mid-80s, he worked 8 to 12 hours a day. Between the ages of 85 and 90, he published 7 books. From Benjamin Harrison to Gerald Ford, he was acquainted with at least 12 of the men who became President of the United States, and he served 5 of them in an official capacity. He wrote incessantly. A bibliography of his published writings and addresses contains over 1,200 entries. When Herbert Hoover died in 1964, he had lived 90 extraordinarily productive years, including a full 50 in public service. It was a record that in sheer scope and duration may be without parallel in American history. If the formidable magnitude of Hoover's accomplishments has tended to retard a complete assessment of his place in history, a second factor has also contributed, and that is the personality and character of the man himself. From the time he entered public life in World War I, there was always something enigmatic about him. Blunt, laconic, protective of his personal privacy, with an aura about him of aloof and impersonal efficiency, Hoover was not an easy man to understand. Many contemporaries, in fact, were puzzled by him. Who's Hoover was the title of a book written about him during the election campaign of 1928. Is Hoover human? Asked a noted magazine article that same year. An associate in the Wilson administration later remarked, "Writing about Herbert Hoover is like trying to describe the interior of a citadel where every drawbridge is up and every portcullis down, thus leaving nothing for inspection but a stretch of blank wall." But if Hoover seemed machine-like and inscrutable to some, very few doubted his ability. Said a well-known Quaker to a friend about to visit Secretary of Commerce Hoover, "Don't let him get thy goat. He'll sit there and hear thee talk, and so far as thee can tell, thee might just as well be talking to a stump or a stone. But he'll not miss a thing." He was right. Hoover's reserve and taciturnity, his tendency as an administrator to rely on intermediaries to achieve his objectives while he quietly masterminded their efforts from behind the scenes, these and other traits have made it difficult to discern his true, often catalytic role in crucial episodes throughout his career. Given this panoply of character traits, some of them no doubt arising from his early orphanhood, it is not surprising that for many people Hoover long remained what a famous journalist called him in 1928, an enigma easily misunderstood. A third, more concrete factor has also contributed to the lingering perplexity about Hoover. It was only in 1966, 2 years after his death, that the bulk of his papers, comprising literally millions of documents, became available to scholars for the first time at his presidential library in Iowa. Only then could the real Herbert Hoover, so to speak, emerge at last from obscurity. All of this helps to explain the continuing lack of consensus about our 31st president. To these factors, we must add one more. Hoover left office in 1933 during the greatest national trauma since the Civil War. For a generation after he left the White House, he was the focus of highly personalized historiography, in which he was portrayed as either the hero or more frequently as the villain of a great moral drama culminating in the New Deal. It has taken a long time for the blinding passions of that era to subside. Nevertheless, with the passage of time, the receding of partisan emotion, and the opening of the Hoover papers, we have entered a new era of Hoover scholarship. For the first time, it is becoming possible to take a relatively dispassionate measure of this unusual man. In the autumn of 1928, as Hoover was seeking the presidency, a certain mediocrity was running for city council in Augusta, Georgia. The candidate apparently knew his limitations, for he announced in his campaign advertisements, "I know I'm not much, but why vote for less?" With Herbert Hoover, we do not, so to speak, have to choose between him and voting for less. For unlike most men in politics then or since, Hoover possessed a social vision, a coherent sense of what he was doing in public life and why. How then shall we understand this political orphan? I suggest we begin by asking how he understood himself. A son of Quaker parents, living in Iowa a decade after the Civil War, Hoover grew up in a Republican village where the only Democrat, as he remembered it, was the town drunk. Identifying himself in 1910 with the progressive wing of the Republican Party, he contributed financially in 1912 to Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose presidential campaign. Early in 1920, after the war, in response to pleas that he run as either a Democratic or Republican candidate for president, Hoover first labeled himself an independent progressive, alienated, he said, from Republican reactionaries and Democratic radicals alike. A few weeks later, he affirmed a Republican affiliation and allowed his name to be placed on the presidential ballot in California, his adopted state. After losing that state's presidential primary to Senator Hiram Johnson, Hoover declared, "I do not believe that this country is either reactionary or radical. I believe that the country at heart is progressively liberal. I believe that the better way to secure needed reforms in political, social, and economic conditions is through the progressive element in the Republican Party." This then was Hoover's self-image in 1920, near the beginning of his active career in American politics. It was also how others perceived him. Early that year, before he announced definitively that he was a Republican, the New Republic magazine, Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, journalist Walter Lippmann, Jane Addams, the social worker, and numerous other members of the progressive wing of American politics supported Hoover for the presidency. Nor were they alone. He was the preferred candidate of the Ivy League. Poll after poll on the nation's elite campuses disclosed overwhelming student and faculty sentiment for him. One group of Hoover boosters sent a presidential poll by mail to every name listed in Who's Who. Of the first 1,000 responses, 716 were for Hoover. Among those who entreated Hoover to run as a Democrat was his wartime friend, Franklin Roosevelt. In a letter to a mutual friend in January 1920, Roosevelt declared of Hoover, quote, "He is certainly a wonder, and I wish we could make him President of the United States. There could not be a better one." Unquote. Roosevelt hoped to become Hoover's running mate, an idea by no means far-fetched. So powerful was the pro-Hoover tide among Democrats in early 1920, Democrats looking for a successor to Woodrow Wilson, that Hoover actually won the Democratic presidential primaries in New Hampshire and here in Michigan without lifting a finger or spending a cent. In fact, he won the Michigan primary about a week after he announced publicly that he was going to run in the Republican primary in California. I don't think it was a matter of the news traveling slowly to Michigan, by the way. It was rather that Hoover had built up an enormous nonpartisan and liberal reputation, and the Democrats found it hard to give up on him. In retrospect, it is clear that Hoover might well have obtained the Democratic presidential nomination that year. Certainly many leading Democrats were ready to try to secure it for him. Instead, he cast his lot with the Republicans and saw his presidential dreams quickly dissolve. But all was not lost. Among the GOP leaders whom Hoover most impressed was Warren G. Harding, who once remarked that Hoover was the smartest gink he knew. In 1921, the admiring Harding selected Hoover for his cabinet over the bitter objections of the Republican old guard. Thanks to Harding, Hoover escaped political oblivion. Hoover was primarily a man of action, a man for whom the highest purpose of life was practical achievement. But he was also capable of philosophical reflection. Late in 1922, in a little book entitled American Individualism, he expounded his understanding of the American socio-political system. According to Hoover, the revolutionary upheavals of World War I and its aftermath had produced a world in ferment. In this cauldron, collectivist ideologies alien to America were competing for the minds of men and women. To Hoover, who had just seen in post-war Europe the vicious results of blending bestial instincts, as he called them, with idealistic humanitarian jargon, the need for a definition of the American alternative was urgent. He called this alternative American individualism. By this term, he did not mean unfettered, old-fashioned laissez-faire. Hoover was anxious that individual initiative be stimulated and rewarded. Initiative, in fact, was one of the character traits he most admired. Progress, he declared, is almost solely dependent on the few creative minds who create or who carry discoveries to widespread application. These minds, he said, must be free to rise from the mass. But the values of individualism, he argued, must be tempered by that firm and fixed ideal of American individualism and equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity, the demand for a fair chance as the basis of American life. This, in Hoover's words, was our most precious social ideal. Hoover did not believe that equality of opportunity was automatically self-sustaining in a modern economy. As a progressive, he believed that some governmental regulations and legislation, such as inheritance taxes on large fortunes, were necessary to prevent inequality of opportunity and the throttling of individual initiative. Like many other progressives, he abhorred the notion of a rigid, class-conscious society. To him, it was imperative that we keep the social solution free from frozen strata of classes. As he put it some years later, The uniqueness of American society lay in its ideal of a fluid, classless society. It was, he said, the point at which our social structure departed from all others. Hoover was not, to use today's terminology, a libertarian. In fact, he explicitly rejected the philosophy of laissez-faire, which he defined pejoratively as every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost. It was, he claimed, an outmoded social doctrine, which America had abandoned when we adopted the ideal of equality of opportunity, the fair chance of Abraham Lincoln. In the context of 1921 to 33, Hoover was a governmental activist. As Secretary of Commerce, he took the initiative in national waterway development, including the project that culminated in the Hoover Dam, in radio regulation, aviation regulation, stabilization of the coal and railroad industries, abolition of the 12-hour day in the steel industry, and elimination of industrial waste. He was one of the foremost exponents of governmental public works expenditures as a form of counter-cyclical economic policies to deal with recessions and depressions. He seemed ubiquitous. At times, he got on Calvin Coolidge's nerves. Nominated in 1928 for the presidency over the opposition of GOP conservatives and some elements of big business, Hoover conceived his term of office as a reform presidency and set to work with characteristic drive. When the Great Depression came, the federal government under his leadership responded with what at that time was unprecedented intervention in a peacetime economy. This, he said later, and approvingly, is hardly laissez-faire. But if Hoover was not a free market purist, neither was he a proto-New Dealer. It is absolutely crucial, if we are to understand him, that we comprehend the purpose and boundaries of his activism. Time and again, he insisted that governmental involvement in the economy must be kept consistent with the broad American traditions of voluntary cooperation, local self-government, and individual initiative. The purpose of Hoover's limited governmental regulation, as he saw it, was to strengthen and preserve American individualism, not to supplant it. How was this to be done? As Hoover perceived it, the fundamental role of the federal government was to stimulate the private sector to organize and govern itself. I believe cooperation among free men can solve many problems more effectively than government, he declared in 1937. During the 1920s and 1930s, early 30s while he was president, Hoover, in office, willingly used government as a device to facilitate this cooperation through publicity, through collection and dissemination of statistical data, and especially through the convening of conferences of private sector representatives meeting with government officials. Between 1921 and 1924 alone, to give but one example, Hoover's Commerce Department sponsored over 900 such conferences on the single subject of efficiency and standardization of manufacturers and products. I understand, incidentally, that until Hoover's time, there was no standardization of milk bottles. We don't use milk bottles today, but we did through much of the 20th century. And it was as a result of this drive towards standardization that the number of milk bottles was simplified to about 4 or 5, saving all sorts of lost production in terms of odd sizes of milk bottles. A small thing, but Hoover's mind worked that way, and he pushed that sort of thing with considerable effect in the 1920s. Certainly there was much of the modernizer and efficiency engineer in him. Indeed, in some quarters during the 1920s, it must be reported, the Secretary of Commerce came to be regarded as a meddling bureaucrat. Franklin Roosevelt, for instance, told a friend in 1928, and I'm quoting, that Hoover has always shown a most disquieting desire to investigate everything, and to appoint commissions and send out statistical inquiries on every conceivable subject under heaven. He has also shown in his own department a most alarming desire to issue regulations and to tell businessmen generally how to conduct their affairs. That was Franklin Roosevelt in 1928. Hoover, then, was no enemy of innovation. He believed in the conscious use of modern social science for the amelioration of social ills. Yet we must not lose sight of the fact that for all of Hoover's progressive impulses, he also had a conserving purpose: the preservation in an urban industrial society of the American tradition of equal opportunity. Whenever possible, he searched for non-coercive arrangements to solve such problems as unemployment. In the 1920s, for instance, long before Social Security, he tried to encourage insurance companies to establish a private system of old age pensions. He organized and skillfully led such private institutions as the American Child Health Association and the Better Homes in America movement, the latter devoted to the profoundly conservative goal of wide diffusion of home ownership. He mobilized the resources of great private foundations in the cause of scientific and social research, such as studies of the business cycle and how to manage it. While an activist for his time in the use of governmental power, he employed it repeatedly to facilitate the growth of non-governmental institutions. Hoover's idiosyncratic blend of progressivism and anti-statism pleased neither the left nor the right. Difficult to pigeonhole, he had little support among professional politicians who sensed his highbrow disdain for their methods. Not surprisingly, during his presidency, his relations with Congress were abysmal. He labeled one senator the only verified case of a negative IQ. When in 1930, one of Hoover's granddaughters was born, his first response was, "I'm glad she doesn't have to be confirmed by the Senate." In a whimsical mood one day, he remarked, "There ought to be a law allowing the president to hang 2 men a year and without being required to give any reason." With the advent of the Democrats to power in 1933, Hoover, for the first time in his public life, found himself in opposition. The man who had once been acclaimed as the great humanitarian and master of emergencies now took up a new role of evangelist and inveterate crusader against political heresy. In the years ahead, he endeavored to define his social philosophy in the face of the challenge posed by the New Deal. The impending battle in this country, he told an associate shortly after Roosevelt's first 100 days in office, would be between a properly regulated individualism and sheer socialism. That, he said, was likely to be the great political battle for some years to come. As the months passed, Hoover increasingly identified his own philosophy as that of, in his words, historical liberalism, and he excoriated the collectivist, regimenting false liberalism, as he called it, of the New Deal. The New Deal, he said, having corrupted the label of liberalism for collectivism, coercion, concentration of political power, it seems historic liberalism must be conservatism in contrast. So it was that in the last third of his life, Hoover, the former bull mooser, the self-styled progressive Republican of the 1920s, became a counter-revolutionary, a defender of what he called true liberalism. It was once remarked of Hoover that he was too progressive for the conservatives and too conservative for the radicals. Such, I suspect, will be the response of some in this audience tonight. Clearly, there are elements of Hoover's thought that do not easily comport with contemporary American conservatism. His energetic expansion of the federal government's role in economic life in the 1920s and 1930s, for instance. His unequivocal repudiation of laissez-faire. His faith in social science research as a basis for the rational reordering of our institutions. Some conservatives particularly may be troubled by a feeling that Hoover, the engineer, conceived society as something to be continuously and endlessly reformed. He just would not leave things alone. Yet if parts of Hoover's philosophy have an unconservative sound, it is also evident that he was not a Rooseveltian liberal. First, as a tireless exponent of voluntarism, he emphatically repudiated the coercive, statist philosophies of communism, socialism, fascism, and, he said, the New Deal. To Hoover, burgeoning bureaucracy was a pernicious enemy of the creative impulses upon which freedom and prosperity depend. True liberalism, he declared, is found not in striving to spread bureaucracy, but in striving to set bounds to it. Secondly, unlike many later liberals, Hoover did not believe that the federal government exists for the primary purpose of redistributing wealth. To be sure, he believed, as he stated in 1936, that economic fair play required that the economically more successful must, through taxes or otherwise, help bear the burdens of victims of misfortune and of the ebb and flow of economic life by providing for old age, unemployment, better homes, and health. Hoover accepted, if you will, the concept of a safety net provided by government and paid for by taxation. Moreover, as I mentioned earlier, he favored stiff inheritance taxes on large fortunes, a position that put him at odds with the DuPont family and other wealthy backers of the anti-FDR Liberty League. Yet he did so not out of a socialistic yen to soak the rich or penalize success, but because the notion of a wealthy, privileged class perpetuating its economic power for generations was anathema to his philosophy of American individualism. Everyone should be free, he believed, to rise in the world, as he had done, without artificial encumbrance. Equality of opportunity, not equality of result, was his governing principle. The human particles, he said, should move freely in the social solution. Another set of concerns that tended to separate Hoover from the liberalism of his day related to his abiding interest in fostering economic growth. For all of his efforts in the 1920s to rationalize the economic order right down to the size of milk bottles, Hoover never lost his vision of America as a perpetual frontier. How he inveighed at the economy of scarcity that he believed the New Deal was imposing on our nation. The notion that we get richer and more prosperous by producing less, he said in 1936, is about as progressive as a slow-motion film run backwards. How he criticized the view, popular for a while in the 1930s, that the era of American abundance was over and that the frontiers of opportunity were closing. When we concede, he said, when we concede that progress is ended, we concede that hope and new opportunity have departed. That is the concept of a static nation. It is necessarily the philosophy of decadence. No society can become static. It must go forward or back. No society will function without confidence in its future opportunities. Fundamentally, he was interested in multiplying wealth, not dividing it. Further, unlike many of his foes on the left, he knew that the creation of wealth did not occur by accident. Finally, more than any other man who has held the presidency, Hoover was profoundly acquainted with the social systems of the old world. He had spent much of his adulthood abroad. He had seen, as he later put it, the squalor of Asia, the frozen class barriers of Europe. He had seen the haughty oligarchies of the right, the bloody tyrannies of the left, and the hatreds, injustices, and miseries they engendered. He had seen the terrible consequences of imperialism, war, and revolution, as few Americans ever had. And he had seen America in contrast. This perception of contrast between the old world and the new was the experiential core of Herbert Hoover's social philosophy, and it had a profoundly conservative effect upon him. It gave him a lifelong understanding of America as a uniquely free, humane, classless society that had come closer to implementing its ideals than any other nation on earth. Hoover judged the imperfections of the American system not as a person on the left might, by standards never before realized and perhaps impossible to attain, utopia. He judged it as a conservative would in the historical and comparative perspective of other societies, other experiments, other ideologies that had failed. Some years ago, a conservative member of the British Parliament addressed his constituency during an election campaign. Concluding his remarks, the Tory orator proclaimed, "These are our principles. If you do not like them, we have others." Unlike this amiable cynic, Herbert Hoover was a man of principles. Principles that found their touchstone in the concept of equality of opportunity. Orphan, engineer, humanitarian, statesman, he was the veritable embodiment in his lifetime of a formative ideal in our history, the ideal of upward mobility. Since the time of Abraham Lincoln, the American people by and large have stood for this principle and for the only kind of society in which such a principle makes sense, a free, dynamic, capitalist society, a society of promise and hope, in which men's and women's fulfillment in life is determined not by group identity or arbitrary governmental decree, but by their own inner resources, by merit. For as long as Americans cherish this ideal and strive to create a society based upon it, they will find appeal in the philosophy and vision of Herbert Hoover. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, George Nash. That was a very insightful talk on Herbert Hoover. I learned quite a bit, as I'm sure everybody in the audience did. And you have cards, index cards, in which you can write questions now that you can pose to Dr. Nash. And we invite you to jot it down, pass the card to either end, and we will collect the card and try to get to your question yet this evening. And while we're waiting for those questions to be written out and passed forward, I'd like to take this moment to mention the exhibit that is going on here. Well, there's so much going on here at the Ford Museum. I mean, you can go anywhere in this museum and find lots to ponder and enjoy. But a very special exhibit that originated right here at the Ford Museum. And Jim Kratzis, the museum director here, should get the credit for this. It's on the 1920s. It's why we have speakers on the 20s this month. But the exhibit is called All That Jazz, America in the 1920s. And it has all kinds of wonderful things looking at this pivotal decade in our in 20th century. And also, something that goes along with the exhibit is a film series beginning next Wednesday. And the opening film at 7 o'clock next Wednesday night is the 1925 version of Ben-Hur. So this isn't the Charlton Heston, but the prototype for Ben-Hur. And I guess there's in the exhibit we even have the costume worn by the actor in Ben-Hur. So this will be followed by other movies every Wednesday night in the month of March, right? For every Wednesday in March. So we invite you also to avail yourselves of the exhibit and the film series here. Well, while we have the questions, I'd like to ask the first question, Dr. Nash, and that is, what were Hoover's leadership qualities? I mean, the man obviously was able to move tremendous resources. What were his leadership qualities that enabled him to do this? What was it in his personality and character that made him such an effective leader?
Before I answer that, Gleaves, I'll just say that your method of securing questions reminds me of a Hoover press conference. This is the way it was done before Roosevelt. The questions were written out on cards, and I think in Hoover's case, sometimes they were submitted a day before. The media would get very annoyed when he would come in and announce that there wasn't anything to discuss, no questions, or if he didn't want to answer certain things, those questions tended to disappear from the stack. I can't do that here because it's a little too conspicuous, perhaps. Coolidge did the same thing, and I'll digress a bit further if I may to tell you a Coolidge anecdote. This does help to perhaps set the context out of which Hoover came a little better. Coolidge had frequent news conferences, I think about twice a week. And on one occasion, the media decided to play a practical joke on him, as I understand it. They all wrote out the same question. So Coolidge, looking stone-faced, was going through, and it was a question he didn't want to answer either. So he got the first one, and he looked, and without cracking a smile, he just went through the whole stack, and then proceeded to say, well, I have a question here about the price of oranges in Brazil, or something like that, totally, and proceeded to give a little discourse on that, and totally ducked the question. But anyway, this little procedure, which I think is a good one, for the speakers, and it saves time probably as well, is one that I think Hoover would have approved of. But to answer your very good question, Hoover, throughout his life, had an ability to engender great loyalty among those who worked for him. And I think there were several reasons for that. Most of the people who worked for him in the Belgian relief stayed with him as his boosters for years to come. They became a kind of organizational basis even for his later political efforts. There were reasons for his engendering that loyalty. For one thing, the causes with which he was identified were immensely powerful humanitarian causes. The people who were working with Hoover in Belgian relief to save an entire nation from the threat of starvation during World War I were people who felt very moved by what they were doing and very committed to what they were doing. And they were committed to the chief, as Hoover came to be known. That wasn't a name that was peculiar to him. A number of people were called the chief at the time. William Randolph Hearst, I guess, was called the chief by some of his subordinates. So it seems to have been a term in the air in those days. But Hoover, for the rest of his life, was known to his more intimate friends as the chief. And they not only had an identification with his cause, but with the sacrifice that he was making for that cause himself. You see, he would not take an income for what he was doing. Or to put it more precisely, when he was in government service, he had to accept his salary, but he didn't spend it on himself. He used it to supplement salaries of people around him or to give to charity and so forth. So this example of self-sacrifice on his part was, I think, a very bonding element also. And so not only did he sacrifice financially and give up a career as a mining magnate to go into World War I relief and beyond, go into public life, a life of service. Not only did he do that, but there was an aura around him, you see, of service. So the people who worked for him were identifying with the chief who exemplified the very best in American life. He also prized the quality of initiative, as I mentioned in my lecture. And so he tended to give his ablest subordinates a lot of room He didn't give them detailed bureaucratic directives and minute directions on how to do things. He would simply say, there's a job, go do it. Here's a pencil, here's a paper, there's a wastebasket. Write your memos, work it out, go do it, report back when you have something to report back. So he didn't go by organization boxes and bureaucratic caution. So this tended to bring out the best in people. Another key ingredient, I think, in his leadership ability was that he had what Walter Lippmann once called the greatest gift for exposition, meaning verbal exposition, of any man Walter Lippmann had ever met. Hoover was enormously learned on subjects that he was studying at the time. He knew the facts, he knew the statistics, he organized his presentations very well. He impressed all sorts of people as being not only committed in the idealistic sense to these good causes with which he was associated, but also being knowledgeable about them and having, in other words, an extraordinary expertise. I just last week, I think, ran across a little evaluation of Hoover that a British diplomat sent home to London from the British Embassy in Washington, probably in 1920. And he said Hoover was the kind of man who didn't really appeal to a large crowd. He didn't have that kind of charisma, but he was a man who could impress a deputation, meaning bring a group of 20 people into a room, sit them down, and Hoover would just take command of that situation. And he would not only impress the people around him, those people, and they generally, would be leaders themselves, but he would inspire them, and they'd want to go out and just do their best for him. This is the effect he had on Woodrow Wilson, the first time Woodrow Wilson met him, I think in 1915, when Hoover came back from Europe to get American support for his relief work in Belgium, and he needed the American government to back him up. Some unpleasantness was happening that threatened to hurt his organization. He needed the President of the United States, Wilson, to support him. And Wilson wrote a letter, possibly it was to his second wife, I don't recall at the moment, but he wrote a letter to someone saying, "Such men make me in love with duty." So I think that those are some of the ingredients in this capacity that Hoover had to inspire among those who worked under him great loyalty, and they then became a kind of alumni group. They'd have alumni gatherings right through the rest of Hoover's life. They called the ARA, the American Relief Association, they called themselves the Eremites, ARA, Eremites, and they would have annual banquets and so forth. They had an alumni magazine. These people stayed together. This was a high point in their lives. Now think of it, saving 80 million people's lives or more after World War I was an enormous undertaking, and those who were involved, not just Hoover, felt proud of it, and rightly so, for the rest of their lives. So that was another, I think, another bonding agent. Now it has to be said on the other side of the coin, and I'll end with this, that Hoover did not always impress those who were his equals. As Secretary of Commerce, he was Undersecretary of every other department, and Secretary Hughes, Secretary of State Hughes, and some of the other cabinet secretaries who were strong-minded men also did not care for his bureaucratic encroachments. And Hoover did not have the best of reputation in the political class, because it seemed he didn't mind his own bureaucratic business. He was always trying to build on his bureaucratic empire. And so he did not succeed quite so well that way, although he had this popular mystique because of the great humanitarian master of emergencies reputation that he had gained in World War I. And if you think about it, Hoover was one of the few Americans, other than military men occasionally, who got elected president without holding another public office first, that is, another elective public office first. And that, again, was because of this humanitarian identification. But he didn't appeal to the professional politicians too much, as I indicated. He acted, or they thought he acted, superior to them. When he entered public life, he said he couldn't make up his mind. He didn't want the reactionary Republicans. He didn't like the bosses and so forth. And he struck a very independent attitude, and they thought he was condescending. And also, they had their own bases of popular support, and they weren't going to be pushed around too much. But they always distrusted him. He was not predictable. He was not a party man, even though he learned to become, to some extent, a party man. So it wasn't a perfect leadership style, but among those who worked for him, he retained their loyalty, and they stayed with him and enabled him to do a great deal over many years to come.
We've got some really good questions here. For example, this first one I was struck by, who was Hoover's favorite president who had served before him?
I think it was Woodrow Wilson. Herbert Hoover wrote a book late in his life, one of those books he wrote in his 80s, The Ordeal of Woodrow Wilson, dealing particularly with the Versailles Conference. But it was in considerable measure the story of Hoover's ordeal as well as one of the right-hand men of Wilson. Just to elaborate a bit on that, at the very end of World War I, November 1918, Wilson sent Hoover back to Europe, and Hoover took over the enormous relief and reconstruction effort. He was also one of Wilson's principal advisors during the peacemaking process that culminated in the Treaty of Versailles. And Hoover came to see Wilson's limitations, it must be said. He thought that that Wilson had made a mistake in going to Europe and not bringing any well-known Republicans with him. That Wilson had made a number of mistakes, which Hoover partly attributed to Wilson's rigidity deriving from his declining health. But he also felt that Wilson was a man of great vision. He broke with Wilson, not in a personal sense, but he came to view the Treaty of Versailles as needing ratification even with reservations. Wilson refused to compromise. Hoover was willing ultimately to do so. And that was the end of the friendship as far as Wilson was concerned. Wilson regarded Hoover in his very last years as a kind of traitor. And Wilson said some unpleasant things about Hoover. I don't think Hoover was aware of it. I found it in Wilson's correspondence. But Hoover, I think, regarded Wilson as a great but somewhat flawed leader, and I think it's significant that in Hoover's very oldest age, the man that he looked back to and wrote a book about even was his predecessor, Wilson. And it would take another few minutes to expand on Coolidge or Harding, and I won't get into that at this point, but I think that would be the fundamental answer.
A couple of questions have to do with Herbert Hoover's very remarkable wife. Please talk about her.
Well, Lou Henry Hoover Lou Henry was her name. She was born like Hoover in Iowa in the same year. She was a few months older than he was. And they met at Stanford University in California. She had gone to live in California and ultimately ended up as a freshman at Stanford. She had gone to what is now San Jose State, I think, for a time. And so she was a freshman when he was a senior, even though they were approximately the same age. But she chose to be a geology major, possibly the first woman in the United States to be a geology major formally in college. I don't know how one can totally prove that, but she was certainly among the earliest. It wasn't a woman's field. At any rate, that's where they met. The story is that when he left in 1898, while she had just graduated and she went off and I think taught for a short time. Anyway, when he was down in Australia and he got a better job offer to go to China, he telegraphed her, "Will you marry me?" And she responded yes, and so he came back and they got married in her home in Monterey, California in 1899 and took a slow boat to China the next day. And they were in the Boxer Rebellion. Now, someone was telling me that among the exhibits I think you've had here was an exhibit of a gun that Lou Henry Hoover had during the Boxer Rebellion. I know that she had a pistol that she was willing to use if the Chinese, the Boxers, were besieging the foreign settlement in the city of Tianjin, if they should overrun the establishment and attempt to slaughter all the Westerners who were bottled up there, that she was willing at the last extremity to fire away. She had grown up as a bit of a tomboy, an outdoor girl in California. And as a geology major, she could relate to her husband intellectually. She never got the press, you might say, that has come since Eleanor Roosevelt established the First Lady role as a very public role. Although Lou Henry Hoover did a number of things that moved in that direction. She made radio addresses as First Lady, for example. She was, in her own way, a remarkable person, and there are There's one biography of her out now, and I know of at least 2 more that are coming out shortly. So she is about to be rediscovered more, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Another question has to do with Hoover's Quaker background and any religious experiences or commitments that he had as an adult. Can you comment on that and how anything from his religion impacted his policies?
Well, that is a difficult question to answer, and historians are somewhat divided upon it. How influential was the Quaker background on Hoover? I lean toward the side that it was not that powerful. He grew up in a Quaker household, in a Quaker community. His mother was you would say, a Quaker evangelist, and he certainly was exposed to what we would now call the evangelical brand of Quakerism. There was a kind of divide among Quakers in Hoover's boyhood, and his mother was on the evangelical side. Hoover had, I think, a theistic faith. It's not one that he wrote a lot about or talked a lot about, but he was not an active Quaker in the sense of church attending very much. I can't find any evidence that from college until the 1920s, period of over 20 years, about 30 years, that he ever went to church with any regularity. He did attend meeting as a Quaker in the presidency, partly, I think, because he felt that the role of the president included that kind of commitment. And he brought in a professor from Stanford University to more or less superintend the Quaker meeting that he attended in Washington, D.C. And he contributed some to certain Quaker causes. After he was president, his Quaker affiliation that he had made as a teenager in Oregon, where he spent a few years before going to college, his Quaker affiliation came up at the meeting, which of course he hadn't attended for years because he didn't live in Oregon. And somebody had the rather silly notion of just dropping him from the rolls. And Hoover was rather offended by that. So obviously it was part of his identity. And the Quaker president of what is now George Fox University in Newburgh arranged for Hoover's membership to be transferred from the Salem meeting in Oregon to the Newburgh meeting. And so Hoover kept up the formal affiliation, but I can find hardly any cases from the time he left the White House until the time he died in 1964 that he ever went to any church service. And I asked his surviving son once about this, and his son said that they hadn't really been brought up very much as Quakers. Again, one can find occasional theological language used by Hoover. I think he had a certain faith, but it was not one that he discussed. And he once said that while he was raised a Quaker, he didn't work very hard at it. Well, in those ways he didn't, but I think in certain other ways it had the effect. The humanitarian work, I think, can in part be derived or traced to the Quaker influence of his boyhood. His relatives taught him that he should do good works. He should make something of himself in life. He should serve others. And I think that had a broad impact, if not one that would be theologically all that articulate. It was a noted Quaker, Elton Trueblood, who presided at one of the, I think at the gravesite ceremony when Hoover died in 1964. I believe that was at the family request. So Hoover was always part of the Quaker fold, but not actively so. Another reason he wasn't too active was that the Quakers in his later years tended to be more politically liberal. So Hoover, who by that time was thought of as a conservative, didn't feel all that comfortable with certain kinds of Quakers. So he tended to be more quietistic and not associative in that faith. So I don't see Quakerism as the all-purpose explanation of Hoover. I really don't. I think that his Stanford experience and his engineering experience and the ethic that it taught him of service more than self. I'm borrowing there from the Rotary Club motto, I think, service above self. Self, well, that in a way defines Hoover, but it had many sources and not just Quakerism. Someday I'm going to write an essay, I think, just called The Religion of Herbert Hoover, because it is a complicated matter and it does show a number of interactions between him and Quakers. And also, I find interesting the way he took a public role as president and then he it subsided after he was president. Some might say critically, well, this means Hoover wasn't sincere. I wouldn't go that far. I think he felt that part of his necessary public role was to uphold the Christian heritage. His heritage, even though he wasn't too active at it, was the Quaker heritage, and that was what he professed.
Last couple of questions here. More on a personal note, what made you interested in pursuing Hoover to the extent that you have?
Well, the short answer to that is that I was invited by the Hoover Presidential Library Association to write a definitive scholarly biography of him. It was not something that I had awakened one morning thinking, aha, I have found my life's work, Herbert Hoover. I had just finished a dissertation, now a book, on the conservative intellectuals, and when this opportunity arose, it seemed that it was a very logical transition. And the more I looked at Hoover, the more I discovered what I hope you may have discovered this evening, that there was far more to Hoover than the starched collar, one-term president who had this image of being cold and uncaring. Hoover's 4 years in the White House were but 4 out of 50 years in public life. What I found about Hoover was that he had several careers that expanded, took decades to fill out. And his mining career was the subject of my first volume in Australia and China and elsewhere. Remarkable career. He was a remarkable man. So I didn't get bored with him. And while I'm doing a book on Hoover and Roosevelt now and further studies on conservatism as well, I don't spend all my time on Hoover. Nevertheless, he is a neglected and I think remarkable figure. And I'm not here as his defender, by the way, waving the flag for Hoover, because I don't necessarily agree with all of his policies, but I see him as a significant and misunderstood figure, and I still find it interesting to talk about him after all these years, because I still find new things about him, and I find that audiences like you are willing to listen and generally know a little, but find there's a lot there that is surprising. And so when I find that I address an audience as receptive as you are, it gives me encouragement to talk to another audience and surprise them a little too, perhaps.
Well, continue to surprise us by giving us a little bit of a preview. This last question, please give us a preview on your next work about the relationship between Hoover and FDR.
Okay. Well, Herbert Hoover and FDR met in World War I. I'm not entirely sure when. I think 1915, certainly by early 1917. Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson, and Hoover came back with this enormous reputation from Belgian relief to take what we might call a sub-cabinet role in the Wilson administration as food administrator. So in the hothouse of wartime Washington, Hoover and Roosevelt became acquainted and were pretty good friends. They socialized now and then. I don't think they were intimate buddies, but they were certainly friends, friendly enough for Roosevelt to admire Hoover and want Hoover to run for president with himself, I think, as Hoover's running mate, as I said. During the 1920s, of course, Roosevelt contracted polio and was out of Washington while Hoover was in Washington. They occasionally had contact. In 1928, when Hoover ran for president, Roosevelt ran successfully for governor of New York. And of course, once Roosevelt was governor of New York, and then the world started to tumble in for Hoover with the Depression, Roosevelt emerged as the likely Democratic opponent. And the rivalry set in, and the friendship petered out, and a number of things happened in personal terms that are really quite intriguing, but I probably can't get into all of them, that soured the friendship. One thing that apparently happened was a Gridiron Club dinner in 1929, just after Hoover was president, and FDR was at the head table, and apparently made a speech that bombed, but it had some, I guess, some heavy-handed satire of Hoover, I would gather. I've been unable so far to find a text of it, but Hoover got up and apparently in front of all those people rebuked FDR and then felt a little badly afterward, maybe he had overdone this. But at that moment, you can see the friction starting to set in. And then there are many other elements in that. And then in 1932-33, after Hoover lost to Roosevelt in the 32 election, the great transition occurred. It was the last of the presidential transitions that lasted all the way from November to March. After that, presidential inaugurations were in January. So it was a long period. It was a period of the collapse of the banks, of the Depression spiraling downward. And Hoover sought to get Roosevelt to go along with certain policy initiatives. Roosevelt thought his hands were being tied, wouldn't cooperate, and felt that Hoover was trying to trap him. Hoover thought that Roosevelt was playing politics and was not rising above partisanship. So they both distrusted each other more and more. And then once Hoover was out of office, he soon emerged as the leading anti-Roosevelt spokesman, the anti-New Deal icon, if you will. And a great deal went on behind the scenes with them, although at one point Eleanor Roosevelt tried to reconcile them when World War II broke out and have Hoover take up a humanitarian project in Europe at the behest of the Roosevelt administration. It didn't happen. Hoover thought that Roosevelt was trying to shunt him off to Europe, get him out of the way, use Hoover's prestige for Roosevelt's nefarious political purposes. Hoover perceived this as a trick. I don't think that was Mrs. Roosevelt's intent. I'm not sure about FDR's purposes. FDR saw Hoover as having a reputation there and was willing to use it in maybe the good and not so good meanings of the word use. Hoover also wanted to run again against Roosevelt, and so he didn't want to be silenced, as it were. Hoover wanted to be the Wendell Willkie of 1940. And he was much distressed when that did not happen. Hoover wanted a comeback. And that's part of the story. And finally, after Roosevelt died in 1945, Hoover spent most of the rest of his 19 years of life in various ways having to fight and overcome what he saw as the negative legacy of the New Deal. And Hoover was attempting to vindicate his own reputation in the eyes of history after being so rejected by the American people and, in his view, wrongly criticized by Roosevelt and his supporters. So Hoover had a great deal to prove. It's a little like Nixon after Watergate. Nixon spent the rest of his ex-presidency writing books on foreign affairs and trying to reestablish himself as a kind of sage in that field. Hoover had somewhat the same impulse, so he had to struggle with the legacy of FDR, and at times that brought him into public controversy with Mrs. Roosevelt, with Arthur Schlesinger, leading pro-New Deal historian. So there are lots of stories that I have to weave into this, and I find it quite intriguing both at a personal and at a philosophical level. And lest you think that this was all just thunder and lightning between them, I should tell you that when Mrs. Hoover died in 1944, the Roosevelts sent condolences, and Hoover sent a very touching note to Mrs. Roosevelt and a rather formal note to FDR, but he did the amenities. And then when FDR died in 45, Hoover wrote a very fine handwritten letter to Mrs. Roosevelt, who wrote back by hand. Those two could somewhat get along, and Mrs. Hoover and Mrs. Roosevelt had dealings in the Girl Scout movement. So there are interesting cross currents here. But it is a story of a friendship that curdled into a rivalry, and with impact on American history. So that's the tale.
Well, thank you very much. That was so interesting. Let's give him a good round of applause. Well, as if that were not dessert enough, I think we now have the opportunity, if you want, to go around and see the exhibit upstairs. I'm told that it'll be open till about 10 o'clock, and you also have the opportunity to have some refreshments outside. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. Dr. Nash will be available to answer any other questions you have informally. So thank you very much for coming this evening.
Well, thank you.